I'm ready.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everyone. This is the name of the course is Understanding. I forgot the name already. But
Fundamentals of learning Rashi.
Fundamentals of learning Rashi. Okay. This is a topic that I could talk about for a long time. It's probably my favorite topic. We're going to begin with a very little bit of biographical information about Rashi. It's really not my field, but it's worthwhile to know at least a couple of little facts. Believe it or not, Rashi was a human being, a person. He actually lived. I have an acquaintance who always comes up to me and says, "How could it be? How could one person write all of those comments on all of the whole Tanakh and almost the whole Shas?" And I say, well, but he did. Yes, he really was one person. His name was Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. He was born in the year 1040. So we're now approaching almost, what is that, almost 1,000 years? Yeah, my math is very poor. But he was born in the year 1040 in the city of Troy in France. At the time, the Jewish population in Troy was approximately 100 families, very small. And the whole French Jewish community was quite small. And according to what I've heard and read, the whole Jewish communities in Germany were quite small. Sometimes you will see that you'll come across people, and you'll come across some very important people who will say that they're descended from Rashi, or they're descended from, it's probably correct because there were so few people in those original Ashkenazi communities that if you can trace yourself back to them, it's more than likely that you're related to Rashi or one of his Talmidim or one of the people close to him. Rashi was a Talmud of Rabbeinu Gershom Ma'or HaGoyla. Rabbeinu Gershom was sort of like the beginning of all Ashkenaz tradition. Rashi did not meet him. He just barely missed him. He died too early, Rabbeinu Gershom. But Rashi was a student of his student, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yitzchak HaZaken. And at about age 18 or 20, Rashi went to the city of Mainz or Mayence in Germany. And there was a yeshiva that had been founded by Rabbeinu Gershom. And the Rashi's main Rebbe was Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar, whom he occasionally mentions by name. I'd have to really look if he mentions him by name in the Chumash. Certainly in the Gemara, here and there, not a lot, but here and there, Rashi will say, I heard this from my Rebbe, Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar. He also had a Rebbe named Rabbi David HaLevi, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Yehuda. He later went to the city of Worms, which is otherwise known as Bermaiza. In Hebrew, we call it Bermaiza, much nicer name than Worms. And at age 30, he went back to his hometown of Troy, and he established his own yeshiva, and that's where he was until he died. I'm really not going to say anything more than that. It's a common assumption that he was in the wine business. There's a famous history professor who wrote a whole book showing that he was not really in the wine business. He knew about wine because if you lived in France, there were lots of people and lots of Jewish people who were involved in the wine industry. And even I can tell you quite a bit about making wine just from learning Mishnayos and learning Gemara. So the fact that someone knows about techniques for making wine really doesn't prove that you were a wine merchant or a winemaker. Okay, let's talk a little bit before we get to what's up on the screen. Let's make believe you don't see that. Before we talk about the principles, let's talk a little bit about Rashi's sources for his commentary on Chumash. The number one source is the words of the Torah and of Tanakh themselves. That is the king of all kings. It's not the Midrash, although he quotes the Midrash extensively. It's not the Gemara, although he quotes the Gemara extensively. The number one source is, what are the words in the Chumash? What are they saying? How do they fit together? How do you translate them? Of course, all 24 books of Tanakh were in front of his eyes. He knew them like he knew his name. or his phone number, even though he had no phone. This in general was the Rishonim, certainly those who wrote on Chumash, in general, even those whose works on Chumash we don't have, they had 24 books of Tanakh at their fingertips, backwards, forwards, inside out. Any pasuk they needed, it was there. How they did this, it's kind of hard to know. I mean, we have computers, we can do a quick computer check. We have the concordancia now for, a few hundred years. You can look things up. The Rishonim, people like Rashi, they just knew it. Okay. Rashi looked very carefully at the meaning of specific words, and sometimes he helped out his students by writing it in Old French, in Laz, he calls it. It's commonly believed that Laz, Lamed Ayin Zayin, stands for Lashon Amzar, the Lashon of a foreign people. I do not believe that. I think that's a drush. Laz means foreign language. It says Yisrael me Mitzrayim, Beis Yaakov me Am Lo Ez. Means when Beis Yaakov left, the Am Lo Ez means a nation that spoke a different language. That's what the word means. They didn't make a verb out of this gematria, out of this Rashi Tevis. No, it's a word. The word Lo Ez means he who speaks a foreign language. Okay. Probably the reason why people think that is because when Rashi, when Rashi says something when he writes something in Old French, he usually writes the word, whatever it is, blah, 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 blah. Usually we don't understand it because we don't speak Old French. And then he'll write bil la'az, and he'll write base, lamed, ayin, apostrophe, zayin. That probably led people to think, oh, it's a Rashi Tevis. It stands for bil lashon am zar. But what they're not paying attention to is, if you look at Rashi's Laz words, even the word itself, he puts in an apostrophe. That was probably just his way of showing that this is not Hebrew. This is something else. But it doesn't mean that everything he writes in Laz is written as an acronym. Okay. Another one of Rashi's major sources is Onkelos, the Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translation of the Torah. Rashi uses it a lot for good reason. I mean, Onkelos lived at the time of the Tanoim. He was a ger, he was a convert to Judaism. He was a Talmud of some of the great Tanoim, and he wrote the translation of the Torah, and it was accepted by the great Tanoim and accepted in Klal Yisrael, and therefore it's a very great source. Once in a while, Rashi disagrees with him. Now you might say, how could Rashi disagree with the Targum? That's like saying he disagrees with Rabbi Akiva, or disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. How can you do that? This is a small but important point. The point is that when Rashi disagrees with the Targum, what he's saying is, he's not saying, I think Onkelos was a dumb guy. I don't think he really understood the pasuk. I disagree. What he's saying is, I don't think that what Onkelos is saying is the pshat. Either he's paraphrasing, but I'm going to say the exact meaning of the word. He's saying the general sense, but I'm going to tell you the exact literal meaning of the words. Or he might be saying that Onkelos is following a midrash. He might be saying that Onkelos is interpreting the pasuk according to a certain opinion in the midrash. I'm going to tell you the simple meaning. So he's not disagreeing. He's saying Onkelos is on one plane over here, and I'm flying on a different level. They're both true levels, but he's going on his level. Okay, another very important thing to Rashi is syntax, is the order of words within a pasuk. We'll get to that eventually. We'll get to some examples, but he certainly looked carefully at that. And of course, context, meaning what came before it, what was in the pasuk before, what is this group of psukim talking about. Sometimes you'll find the disagreement between, let's say, Rashi and Ibn Ezra about the meaning of a word. Now, both of them, Rashi and Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra, who lived a little bit later, they both were very interested in the exact meanings of words in the Chumash. They were both big experts. They both had tremendous amount of knowledge to draw from, but they sometimes disagree. Usually, many times, if you start looking at the pasuk carefully, a lot of times you can find out that Rashi's translation of the word is really driven by the context. It may not be grammatically, philologically as perfect as the Ibn Ezra's translation, but it fits the context better. So context is something very important to Rashi. Okay, other sources of Rashi, of course, are the Talmud, the Gemara, the Midrash. But as we said before regarding Onkelos, Rashi is only interested in the Gemara and in the Midrash if and when they are expressing Pshutei Shel Mikra, the simple meaning of the text. Now, what does it mean, the simple meaning of the text? That's a big question. We'll talk about it here and there. I don't know if we'll hit on it tonight, maybe a different time. I mean, what is called simple is debatable. But certainly Rashi was limiting himself in his commentary on the Chumash to what he considered to be Pshutei Shel Mikra. If the Gemara says something and Rashi feels that it's not the Pshat, so then he doesn't have to follow that. You say, again, the Gemara is talking on this level and I'm talking on a different level. The Gemara is true for its level and I'm saying the truth on my level. So he's not disagreeing. He's not, he's certainly machniya himself. Certainly he bows his head to the Gemara and the Midrash, but he understood that a lot of times the Gemara and the Midrash are saying something deeper about the pasuk, but they're not saying the pshat. Okay. There's also a sefer that he uses, which we don't have. It's called the Yesodei Shel Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan lived a little bit before Rashi in Narbonne, which is in France, different part of France than Rashi lived. I believe it's in the Provence region in the south of France. Rashi was in a different part of France. But Rashi, a number of times in Chumash, quotes Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan apparently wrote a collection of midrashim. There's one place where Rashi says about something that he saw in this book. He says, "In midrashu ekap." If what he's telling us is a midrash, I'll accept it, and if not, I'll disagree. So that means that Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan was collecting midrashim from Midrash Rabbah, Midrash Tanchuma, from other midrashim, which are very ancient and very, very, very important. And maybe sometimes he also put in his own opinion. So Rashi says, if what he's saying here comes from a midrash, I just didn't find it in my copies of the midrash, so I'll accept it. If not, then why can't I disagree with Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan? I mean, he must have been somebody quite important and quite knowledgeable that Rashi's not afraid to disagree. Rashi, as we've mentioned, was very interested in grammar, in diktuk. The great part about Rashi's diktuk is that he does not use technical phraseology, technical vocabulary. If you try to look at some of the diktuk comments of Ibn Ezra, or some of the diktuk comments of some of the really great medaktikim, Ibn Jinach and Dunish ben Labrat, and there's a lot of technical vocabulary. You have to really have somebody explain it to you when it's good, it's great, it's great, but it's very difficult. It really requires an education just to figure out what they're talking about. Rashi does not use that, all of those fancy technical words. Rashi writes about diktuk in plain, simple Hebrew. He leaves out all the technical vocabulary, and he's really teaching you diktuk as he goes along. Whatever I know about diktuk, 99% comes right out of Rashi. So a lot of people are nervous. Oh, I'm just going to skip this Rashi. It's diktuk. It's impossible. And I say, I mean, it's easier for me to say. There are some things that I also can't figure out. But I say, try the diktuk Rashis, because he will teach you the diktuk that you need to know. He's really a wonderful teacher of diktuk. He also quotes some of the great grammarians. He quotes Dunish ben Labrat, who was a Spanish Baldictuk from earlier times. He quotes Menachem ben Sruk, who was another one of the great grammarians. The two of them had horrific fights between themselves. Dunish ben Labrat and Menachem ben Sruk, if you want to read up on the history, they went at each other like cats and dogs. Rashi quotes them both, whichever one he preferred at the moment. There's one place where in Parshas Mishpatim, where Rashi quotes the Azharot of Rabbi Sadia Gaon. Of course, the Rabbi Sadia Gaon was from the period of the Gaonim, in the few hundred years just after the Gemara was finished, after the completion of the Talmud. Rabbi Sadia, among his many writings, he wrote what were called Azharot, some of the great Svardik Chachamim. They wrote piyutim, they wrote poems, which were recited on Shavuos, which contained a little synopsis of all the 613 mitzvahs. And they called them azharos. They are warnings. They're warning us, do this mitzvah, do this mitzvah, do this mitzvah. And they go through all 613. Rashi in one place quotes Rabbi Sadia Gaon. Just last week, I was learning Parshas Shoftim. I saw Rashi quote someone named Rabbi Kalonimus. I'm not sure who he was, but if you can get your name into Rashi's commentary even once, that's pretty good. Okay, those are some of his sources. But most important is just looking at the Chumash and trying to understand what it means. Okay, another point, we've mentioned this already, but I want to talk about it a little bit separately, is that Rashi, well, first of all, Rashi does not write an introduction to his commentary. Some of the other great commentators, they wrote introductions. Ramban writes a long and famous and very beautiful and important introduction to his commentary on the Torah. Ibn Ezra writes an introduction to his commentary, in which he goes through all the different categories of commentators. He says, this one's no good, and that one's no good, and that one's no good. The only proper way is the way I do it. But anyway, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno wrote a beautiful introduction to his commentary on the Torah. Rashi did not. But here and there, Rashi drops us little tidbits about what he had in mind when he was writing the commentary. And the main one is, he says this several times throughout Chumash and other places in Tanakh. He says, I only came to explain Pshutai Shel Mikra. Only came to explain the simple meaning of the psukim. Now, point A is, we mentioned already, that term is debatable. What you think is Pshutai Shel Mikra, to me might be a medrash. And what I think is Pshutai Shel Mikra, to you, you might think it doesn't really fit the words at all. You might think it's just imaginary. It's just a fantasy. Rashi's, if we could say it in a nutshell, Rashi's opinion is that the Pshutai Shel Mikra is something that you can understand more or less by looking at the psukim themselves in context and in the context of the whole Chumash and the whole Tanakh. But basically, you can look at the pasuk and you can have a good mind. You should, and not an unbelievable mind. If you have a good mind, if you have a straight mind, you should be able to understand the Pshutai Shel Mikra. But he also felt that many times when there are difficulties in the pasuk, when there are difficulties in the text, we can find the answers in the Gemara or in the Midrash, and that's also pshat. Even though the Midrash might add something, it might add a certain fact, it might add a certain story behind it, but Rashi felt that that could also be pshat. As we said before, right, when Midrash is a very great study. I'm sure Rashi, I'm sure he knew all the midrashim that he had available to him. He had certain midrashim that we don't have, and I'm sure he learned them and he understood them and he had ideas about them. But the midrash is a mixture of things that are beyond the pshat and things that are on the level of pshat. And Rashi, for his commentary on Chumash, took those things that he felt were on the level of pshat, or what we can call close to pshat. Meaning, true, they maybe go a little bit beyond the simple meaning of the words, but it's only by using this midrash that we can answer certain questions. So therefore, we have to say, yes, what the midrash is saying, that's the pshat. Now, one question which I don't have a great answer for is, why was Rashi so interested in pshat? If you learn Gemara, Mishnah, Midrash, you don't see in those texts themselves such an insistence on pshat. The Gemara all the time is twisting psukim and diving deeper into the pasuk and pulling out more and more. It doesn't limit itself just to this basic level of pshat. Certainly not the midrash. The midrash goes all over, and everything's open for discussion. Everything and anything can be brought in to bear on a pasuk, and it certainly comes out that what the midrash is telling you is more than anybody on their own would have seen in the pasuk. So they seem to go all the time beyond the pshat. Why was Rashi so insistent? One simple answer is that there is a Gemara in Masechta Shabbos, a very famous Gemara about Rav Kahana, who was one of the great Amoraim, one of the great Gemara rabbis, where he makes the astounding statement that I was 18 years old before I realized Ein Mikra Yotze Midei Pshutai. Until I was 18, I thought that psukim sometimes don't have a pshat. I thought the only explanation of the pasuk is a drasha. Anything, maybe anything at all. When I reached 18 years old, I found out. Then I went to yeshiva and I found out Ein Mikra Yotze Midei Pshutai, that a pasuk never leaves its simple pshat, meaning it always has a pshat. No matter how deep we can dive into it, and we can derive more halachas from it, and more musar, and more whatever, and more midrashim, and more, but there's always the simple meaning also always means something, and it's coherent, and it's telling us something important. So we can say that Rashi chose to write his comment on that level. That's a partial answer. I mean, he could have chosen to write his commentary on a different level. I think it's been suggested. I'm not sure if it's been suggested about Rashi, but it's been suggested about some of the other Rishonim that in the Middle Ages, the Christians used to challenge us to debates about the meaning of Scripture. Ramban very famously took part in one of those debates. He won the battle, but he lost the war. He won the debate, and then he was thrown out of Spain, basically. So when Talmidei Chachamim debated the Christians over the meaning of Tanakh, so you really have to go on the pshat level. You can't say to the priest, well, your explanation of this pasuk is wrong because the Midrash says, you say this pasuk is talking about Oso Aish, it's talking about Jesus, but the Midrash says it's really talking about something else. That's not really going to fly because he can just say, well, I don't believe in your traditions. I don't believe in your midrashim. That's just the fantasies of the rabbis. You could say, we the Christians, we look at the verse itself, and this is what it sounds like to us. So it's definitely true that some of the Rishonim delved into the pshat in order to refute the Christians. Whether that's the case with Rashi, I don't know. There are a few places in Tanakh. There's one right near the beginning of Bereshis where Rashi talks about Tshuva Saminim. He says, this explanation will refute the minim. It will refute the heretics. And he probably means the Christians. It's a couple of places. To say that that's the whole reason why he started on this whole tremendous project of explaining the whole Tanakh al pi pshat, I don't know. It's something to think about. But whatever it is, he made up his mind. He took upon himself this project to explain Tanakh al pi pshutai, according to the pshutai shel mikra. Okay, that's the introduction to the introduction. Now we'll get to the main part of the introduction. What I'd like to do this evening in this first lesson is I have put together from various sources, I believe I made it into seven general principles for understanding Rashi, because that's the name of the course, Principles for Understanding Rashi. These come from here and there. The main thing to know is when anyone, any person, any sefer, when they talk about Klolei Rashi, general principles for Rashi, where do they have to come from? They have to come from Rashi himself, meaning we observe how Rashi learns. We observe what he writes in his commentary, and then we say, put it together, we see this must have been his general principle. Since he gives this kind of comment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in the Chumash, so that shows us a general tendency. These things were not, Rashi doesn't tell us these things explicitly, except for maybe 1 or 2. But for the most part, he does not tell us his methodology explicitly. We have to extract it. We have to look at his work and say what must have been his methodology. My one little chiddush when it comes to these matters, and I wrote this in my Sefer Directions in Rashi, is that instead of saying the way of Rashi is X, Y, and Z, which is how dozens of Svarim do it, and there's nothing wrong with it, it's great. I like to say, you, the student, should do the following. You be conscious of this and this and this. That was my little contribution to the field. So let's just take a look at them quickly, and then we'll try to see some, at least a little bit, in detail starting this evening. So number one.
Rabbi Joseph, we don't see any of the sources.
You don't see the sources. You don't see my screen?
No.
Okay, let me make sure I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so far you didn't miss anything because I was not reading from sources. But let me show you now. Share screen. Okay, see it now?
Yeah, we see it. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, you didn't miss anything because until now I was just talking out of my notes. It wasn't on the screen anyway. Okay, here are 7 principles for understanding Rashi. Number 1, and this really, although they're not exactly in any particular order, this one really is number 1. And that is examine Rashi's choice of words carefully. Read his words carefully. He was a very precise writer and a very terse writer. He uses the minimum amount of ink. They say that people say ink in Rashi's times was very expensive. He didn't use much ink. Others say that before he dipped his pen, he dipped his quill in the ink, he was Yoshev Shiva Nekiyim. He waited 7 days and thought about it. Of course, these things are not literal, but you can see, anyone who learns Rashi will see that he's very exact, very precise, and therefore you have to read the words carefully. Included in that is letter A, that you always have to go back and re-examine the scriptural text. Go back and look again at the Chumash. When you read a Rashi and you say, now, what is he saying? Or I know what he's saying, but why would he say that? The first answer always should be, your first line of defense should always be, go back, read the pasuk again. Rashi wants you to read the pasuk. 1 time is usually not enough. Maybe 10 times is not enough. And this you see in the super commentaries. I mean, there are literally hundreds of super commentaries, meaning commentaries on a commentary. Rashi is the commentary, and then we have many, many commentaries explaining Rashi, which we'll mention as we go along. But you have the Yolo Mizrahi and the Gur Aryeh by the Maharal, and you have Maskil the David by Rabbi David Pardo. Those are my 3 favorites. But you have many, many others, and there are many great ones. What they always do is they look at the Rashi and then they say, why is Rashi saying this? Because there's this extra word in the pasuk. There's this little phrase in the pasuk that needed explaining. Always the first thing is go back to the pasuk, look at it again, and see and look. And you'll usually see why Rashi is saying what he's saying, and it will become clear to you what he's saying. That really is rule 1A. Rule 1B is what's called Dibur Hamaskil. Every Rashi begins with a few words that he quotes from the pasuk. This goes back. We don't have an original manuscript of Rashi, unfortunately. We do not have in Rashi's handwriting any text. But if you go back to the earliest Kisvei Yad, the earliest manuscripts of Rashi's commentary, and you go back all the way to the first printed edition, they all have this feature, that there's 2 or 3 words from the pasuk, and then Rashi makes his comment. And all commentators have agreed that Rashi chose those headings very carefully. He chose the heading, he put down exactly the words that he intends to comment on. He's putting down exactly the words that pushed him to say what he's going to say. So you should always examine that carefully. Okay, number 2. And this also really, this should be number 2. Investigate any comment by Rashi that seems to deviate from the simple meaning of Scripture. Rashi himself tells us, I came to explain Pshutei Shel Mikra. If he says anything that doesn't seem to be Pshutei Shel Mikra, then you have to think about it. You have to think, well, why is he doing that? Why is he telling you this midrash? Why is he putting in this halacha, which it doesn't exactly say in the pasuk? So I wrote here, subtopic, sub-item number A, letter A is what is pshat? Of course, we have to think about that. And it's debatable, but we can certainly say that everything Rashi says, we should try to understand that it's pshat. You have to understand how it's pshat and why he came to the conclusion that that's pshat. But just to say that Rashi wrote something because it sounds nice, because it's a nice lesson, because everyone remembers it from when they learned in first grade, no, that's not why Rashi says something. There are some authors who have written that, particularly the more modern, historically minded authors will often talk in those terms. Will say Rashi included in his commentary all of the important lessons that he felt every Jew should know, which I don't disagree with, but I don't think that really explains how he chose what he chose. I think what he chose is because it's pshat. Only after you put it all together, somehow magically, maybe it's Ruach HaKodesh, maybe it's just his great wisdom. Yes, you do come out with a beautiful picture of, obviously not everything, but of a great general picture of what you need to know. That is true. But why he chose a specific comment on a specific pasuk has to be because he felt that's the pshat. If there is, letter B, any extra halachic information in his comment, which we don't see directly in the pasuk, you have to ask why. Why did he put it there? Because Rashi is not the Shulchan Aruch, and he's not the Rambam. He's not. That really was not his main goal in writing his commentary, to teach us all the necessary halachas. I can prove that to you very simply, because there are hundreds and thousands of important halachas which Rashi does not talk about at all in his commentary on the Chumash. It can't be that he wanted to provide us with a guide to Jewish practice. He left out too much. Even when you just talk about what's the Araisi, you say, well, he left out all the Durabanans, because they don't come directly from the Chumash. But even if you look at the D'Oraisa, he left out so much that it's obvious he was not trying to write for us a guide to practical halacha. So if there's any extra halachic information that Rashi is telling us, which is not directly in the pasuk, we have to scratch our heads and say, why is it there? If there's any extra midrashic information that doesn't come directly from the words in the pasuk, again, you have to scratch your head and you have to say, why is it there? Another thing that Rashi generally does not discuss is reasons for mitzvahs. Out of 613 mitzvahs, Rashi might give you the reasons for, I would guess, something like 10%. Someday when I have nothing better to do, I'm going to sit and go mitzvah by mitzvah and mitzvah and see how many mitzvahs does Rashi give a reason. But it's a small percentage. I would guess it's less than 10%. So if you find a Rashi which is telling you the reason for a mitzvah, again, you have to say, wait, why is he doing that? Did he see that in the pasuk? If it's in the pasuk, sometimes the pasuk gives the reason for the mitzvah. Okay, so Rashi's explaining it. Maybe by knowing the reason for the mitzvah, Rashi is answering some question that he had about the pasuk. But there must be some reason. He is not primarily in business for giving us reasons for the mitzvahs. That's not his main interest. Okay, and letter E, I owe to Rabbi Herzog, who many of you I think know or know of, is that Rashi generally does not explain why Hashem does something. There are hundreds of things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does in the Torah, and Rashi doesn't say why. Now, sometimes it's not that hard to figure out, but Rashi doesn't make it a habit that every time God does something, Rashi gives the reason. And why not? Because since the pasuk doesn't say the reason, since Shutei Shel Mikra doesn't say why Hashem did this or that, so it's not Rashi's business. If on occasion Rashi will say Hashem did this because X, Y, Z, that's another scratch your head and think about it. Is it implicit in the pasuk? I just didn't notice it the first time. Is this reason helping us to answer some question that Rashi may have had? You have to think and figure it out. Okay. Number 3. Investigate and understand how Rashi's commentary is a complete commentary. Now, that might sound new to some people. It was new to me when I started to realize it a few years ago. You first start learning Rashi at a young age, and okay, you learn a pasuk, and then Rashi says something very interesting and important. And then you go to another pasuk, and he says something else interesting and important. And then you may go to pasuk number 3, and Rashi says nothing at all. Okay, even though there might be a page in the Midrash about that pasuk, or a whole page in the Gemara, but that third pasuk Rashi doesn't say anything at all. And then you go to pasuk number 4, and Rashi mentions one little thing, but he leaves out 5 other things that the Midrash talks about or the Gemara talks about. And I don't know, you don't really, you're too overwhelmed translating all the words and just understanding everything on a basic level. You don't realize how Rashi's commentary is complete, meaning it has several ramifications when we say it's complete. One thing is no midrashim chalukim. This is actually a disagreement between some of the super commentaries. Sometimes Rashi will explain a pasuk with midrash A, and then you'll be learning 337 psukim later. You're learning another pasuk, and you look at the Rashi, and he says a midrash that sounds like it disagrees with the first one. You say, well, what was it? Did Avraham do this, or did he do that? Rashi over there follows a midrash which says he did this. And Rashi over here follows a midrash. It's a different midrash. We can identify it. It's a different midrash, and Rashi says he did this. So it looks like there's a machlekes. And Rashi's telling you both sides in 2 different places. Some of the great super commentators say, okay, they call it midrashim chalukim. These are conflicting midrashim. They're both true on some level. They're both the opinions of great scholars, of great Talmidei Chachamim. On pasuk number 1, Rashi quoted this midrash. On pasuk number 337, he quoted that midrash. No less than Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, the great Mizrahi, one of the earliest and most important super commentators on Rashi, he says this sometimes. Why is there this contradiction between this midrash here and that midrash there, both quoted by Rashi? He said both. They're both nice. They're both good. Other commentators say, oh, no, that doesn't make any sense at all. No, because then Rashi's not telling us what the pshat is. He's leaving us stranded. Do you mean that Hashem contradicted himself? The Torah was written by one God. One Ribono Shel Olam wrote the Torah. How could it be over here he meant night and over here he meant day on the same topic? So what do you have to do? You have to somehow resolve the two midrashim that look to be contradictory. Now, this is one of the many differences between learning Midrash and learning Rashi. If you're learning Midrash, if you take out the Midrash Rabbah and you say, okay, I'm learning Midrash now. And you learn a Midrash, it says that Avram Avinu did X, Y, Z. And then 5 pages later, you're learning about the same story, and it says Avram did A, B, C, but not X, Y, Z. Say, how could it be? A very good answer can often be, it's a disagreement. Rabbi X thought that he did X, Y, Z. Rabbi Y thought that he did A, B, C. Now you can look, you can say, well, in spirit, they're really the same, but maybe they're putting it into different clothing. But it's not a problem. You can say it's a machlokes. Just like you could have a machlokes, is a certain thing asur or mutar? So you could have a machlokes. Did Avraham Avinu do this or did he do that? And so on. Whatever the story is that we're studying. That's when you're studying the Midrash. Because the Midrash is obviously a conglomeration of many different opinions, said at different times, said in different settings, said on different levels for different people. Some of the Midrashim were said as public drushes for the simple Hamoin Am, for the average person who maybe didn't know very much. Some of them were maybe discussions between great Talmidei Chachamim who were really delving deeply into the deep, profound levels of the Torah. So they could disagree. But when you're learning Rashi, most Mefarshim say that we can take the whole Rashi al Torah and it's one solid rock. And everything within it has to agree with everything else. If you are stuck, okay, you're stuck. So a lot of times you're stuck when you're learning. I mean, you get stuck when you're studying other subjects too, lahavdil. That's fine. You can get stuck and you say, I don't know how the midrash that Rashi quotes here can be resolved with the midrash that Rashi quotes over there. But they say, okay, that's your fault, but not Rashi's fault. We have to go with the premise that if Rashi says two things that look like a contradiction, they're really not a contradiction. Okay, how do you wiggle out of these situations? What are some of the, what's probably the best way is my letter B over here, is look for clarification in other Rashi comments. In general, whenever Rashi says something and you have a question, what does he mean? Is it really pshat? Does it disagree with something else that he said? The first and best place to look, besides the pasuk itself, the next best place to look is in other Rashi comments. Because Rashi was one person, and who better to explain a Rashi than Rashi? I always tell this story. One or two of you may have heard it already. But many years ago, I was in a Svarim store somewhere. I picked up a sefer. It was some contemporary Rosh Yeshiva's comments on the Chumash. A very chashuv Rosh Yeshiva. I guarantee you he knows how to learn better than I do. And I started to look at some of the pieces. So he would start with the pasuk, and then he would quote the Rashi. Then he would say, I have a question on the Rashi. And it would be a good question, a very legitimate, solid question. And then he would say, well, you have to look at the Rambam, Hilchos, whatever. And on the Rambam, there's this question that was asked by Rabbi Chaim Brisker. And Rabbi Chaim answers it like this. But in his son's Chidushim, the Brisker Rav, he answered it like that. And if we put the two together and we look at this Tosfos over there, we can now go like this, and we can say the Rambam is telling us a new idea as follows. And now we can take this new idea that we have gleaned from investigating the Rambam, and we can say that's what Rashi meant. And I saw one piece like this, and another piece like this, and then I put the book down. I said, I don't think this is really how you're supposed to go about understanding a Rashi. You're supposed to look at other Rashis. I mean, that's very nice. You have this beautiful thought that you base on a Rambam. Who's to say that Rashi agreed with it? If you have evidence, that's one thing. But just to think that all the answers are to be found by opening up a Rambam, when you're studying Rashi, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, look, I'm teaching this class, so from me, what you're going to hear is you should look for clarification in other Rashi comments as much as possible. Okay. Another ramification of this idea that Rashi's commentary is a complete commentary is this letter C, understanding verses that Rashi does not comment on. There are verses that Rashi says nothing about. Now, I used to wonder about this when I was much younger. So what are we supposed to do? There's no Rashi there. What if I have a question on that pasuk? Well, I guess I can look at the Ramban, I can look at the Ibn Ezra, look at some other commentary, and whatever they say, I guess that's what Rashi meant also. That's not really, that's very superficial. That's not really what one should do. What you should really do is if there's a pasuk upon which Rashi does not comment, or a question about a pasuk, which is a pshat question, which is a very basic, essential question on the pasuk, a question that really needs to be asked and answered, and Rashi says nothing about it, you should start looking at other Rashi comments and other psukim and see what would Rashi have said about this. And it could be that Rashi felt it was obvious, based on everything he said so far, or based on things that he says in other places. He would have you understand the pasuk in the following way. Okay, we'll give some examples of that eventually. Here's a Shem. I better move on. Number 4, pay careful attention to Rashi's placement of his comments, meaning it's not only important to read the Rashi and read it carefully and see how it relates to the pasuk, you also sometimes have to think, why is Rashi making this comment in this place? For example, it has been noticed by people greater than me. I'm not great at all, but it has been noticed by great people that when there is a contradiction between two psukim, an apparent contradiction, Rashi will usually not talk about it by the first pasuk, because it's all right. The pasuk says the sky is blue. whatever color the pasuk says, that's good. Nothing to talk about. It's when Rashi comes to another pasuk, 20 psukim later, that says the sky is green, then there's a question. And then he will say, well, that's talking on a cloudy day. This is talking on a sunny day, whatever the answer is that he gives. So you should always pay attention to where Rashi places his comments. And if you come to a pasuk, and it's the first pasuk that talks about this topic, and Rashi is saying, yeah, but it says later, so-and-so, that should set off a little bit of fireworks in your mind. So why is Rashi talking about it now? It's not a difficult, this question is not relevant. We don't even know what it says in the other pasuk yet. It must be, obviously, that there is something about this pasuk. There's something about it that Rashi is bothered with, and he's answering it by comparing it to the other pasuk and giving you the answer. But normally, Rashi will address contradictions where they occur, meaning by the second pasuk. By the way, other commentators don't really follow this rule. I have a number of examples where Ramban and Ibn Ezra, when they see a pasuk, they automatically thought of the other pasuk that says the opposite, and right away by the first one they say, well, the answer to the contradiction is like this. But Rashi sticks to this principle, except in this and this and that exception. And if you think a little bit, you can usually figure out why they are exceptions. Okay, number 5. Pay careful attention to Rashi's translations, meaning not only when he uses laws, of course, you should pay attention to that too, but in general, many times, what Rashi is doing in his commentary is simply translating the pasuk. Only he's not translating from one language to another. He's translating, ivrit b'ivrit. He's using other Hebrew words to explain the Hebrew words that are in the Chumash. But pay attention. If he's translating the pasuk in a certain way, there's a reason for it. And his grammatical comments, and always explain his grammatical comments. They are part of his project of explaining the simple meaning of the Torah. In other words, there are great works of diktuk And as we said, they're not easy to read, and they require a lot of prior knowledge. Great. If you can, you should study them. If that's what you're interested in. But Rashi was not writing a book of diktuk. What he was doing is explaining the simple meaning of the Torah. If he pauses and he says, you have to understand this is Lashon Avar, and this is Lashon Rabim, and this is the root of this word is this, but not that, he's not going off on a tangent. He's not. He didn't take a vacation from Chumash 101, and now he's giving a different course on Grammar 101. No, the grammar is there to help us understand the simple meaning of the Torah. So, if at all possible, try to understand what he's saying. Okay, we spoke already at the very beginning about some of Rashi's methods of translation. Eventually, I hope we will have maybe a whole hour or the better part of an hour about different forms of the past tense, something I've become very fascinated with in the last year or two. There's more to the past tense than meets the eye. I mean, you can learn the Chumash literally for years and years and years, and you don't notice that there are really different kinds of past tense in Lashon Kodesh. Okay. Number 6. This is one that you're not going to see in. I haven't seen it in any Sforim, but it's becoming clearer and clearer to me as I continue to learn Rashi on my own. Number 6 is pay careful attention to the first few words of a Rashi comment. They often contain the main point, while the rest of the comment comes to clarify and defend this main point. Very often, the first 2-3 words, that's the gist, that's the main thing. After that, Rashi is either explicitly or non-explicitly, he's saying, well, you might ask on it the following question, I'll answer the question. Well, you might not believe me because other Meforshim say differently, I'll bring a proof, I'll bring a support to my opinion. But the first few words, that's very often, that's really what it's about. And very often, once Rashi gets finished with those first few words, with those first few points, he then becomes much more expansive. He'll start to talk about Tamei HaMitzvahs, which he doesn't usually talk about. He'll talk about halacha, which he doesn't usually talk about. He'll start talking about psukim later in Tanakh, which he normally would leave for later. Because what I think, it's my personal opinion, but I believe it, at least I've tricked myself into believing it, is that Rashi really expects you to look very carefully at the pasuk and to notice the most important questions that need to be answered, and to be ready to hear his explanation, ready to hear what he says, to hear his main point. And he will do that without reference to other halachas, without reference to Tamei HaMitzvahs. All of that is extraneous. That's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with looking very carefully at these words in this pasuk, having in mind the important questions, being ready to hear how Rashi interprets. But once he gets past that and he gets into the defending himself, he gets into the stage of defending himself, or he gets into the stage of raising a question and then answering it, then all different kinds of material can be brought in. He'll bring in from other psukim, he'll bring in from the Gemara halacha, which really it doesn't say in this pasuk. But the point is, he's gone deeper now. He's already made his main point. Now he's answering things. When it comes to answering things and supporting things, he's much more liberal in his use of sources. He starts with a very, very focused look at the pasuk. Once he tells you the pasuk means X, then he gets into the stage of elaborating, defending, answering questions. Then he knew the whole shots, he knew all the midrashim, and he knew all these comments from his predecessors. Now he starts bringing in all of these different things. Okay, the last one, and we have not nearly enough time to even give it preliminary, the preliminary attention that it deserves. But we'll read the words. Pay careful attention whenever Rashi asks a question explicitly. Usually, Rashi does not ask his questions explicitly. He does not usually say, Yesh lishol, tzarach iyan on this pasuk, blah, 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 blah. Why does it say this, that, and that? He doesn't do that. There are other commentators who do, and they're great. Rashi usually just wants you to look at the question, like we said a minute ago, notice what are some of the basic points that need to be explained, and then he comes with this sledgehammer and he says, boom, this is what the pasuk means. And you have to go back and say, now, why is he saying that? Oh, he's answering question A that I thought of, he's answering question B that I thought of, etc. But he normally does not say what his question is. When he does, there must be some reason for it. Many Meforshim say that there's something called the hergesh mibachutz. This is an expression which was apparently coined by the author of Maskil the David, meaning that bachutz, outside of the words that Rashi actually writes, there is a hergesh, meaning a question, there's a feeling, meaning there's something, it's like a little indigestion that Rashi had that is outside of what he actually writes. Meaning he always had some question on the pasuk which he's not telling you. I think the reason he didn't tell you is because he is a demanding Rebbe. Although he's the nicest Rebbe that ever was, everybody loves Rashi. He doesn't obfuscate, he doesn't confuse you, he's clear, he holds your hand, but yet he's also demanding. He demands that you be aware of these little stomach aches that many psukim should give us. That's called the hergesh mibachutz. That's the outside question, meaning that's the question that is outside of what Rashi actually wrote, but it's in the pasuk. He expected you to know what that is. If he's asking a question explicitly, it's really a secondary question. That's what many commentators say. That's a mind-blowing point that you have to hear a lot of examples before it sinks in. But hopefully we'll give enough examples to at least help you to taste it a little bit. Another point, and we'll stop with this, is that this is kind of an advanced level that we're getting to on this last point, but you have to think, what kinds of questions does Rashi ask explicitly? What kinds of questions does Rashi assume that you will be aware of yourself? I mean, we've hinted at it a little bit. The most basic questions Rashi expects you to ask yourself. He's not going to write them for you. Sorry, that's your job. Questions that are a little bit more out there. They might be based on some outside bit of knowledge, some little bit of scientific knowledge or knowledge about how a certain kind of work is done, how they ferment wine in France. That he will write because he didn't expect you to know that. It's not in the pasuk. If the question is based on a Gemara in Bava Metzia Daf Chav Zayin, he didn't expect every person to have that on his mind when reading the pasuk. He will speak that out. He will say that. He will raise that question explicitly. Those are the kinds of questions he didn't expect you to have in mind. Sukkim that we didn't read yet. If we're in Bereishis, he doesn't expect you to have in mind all of the psukim in Bamidbar and Barim, and so on. If he has a question based on one of those psukim, he will write it explicitly. But the basic questions that anyone reading the verse, anyone reading the text should be aware of, he was a very demanding Rebbe. He said, you have to know that. I'm just going to tell you what the pasuk means. You can go back and figure out what was motivating me to say it. What were the questions that I was trying to answer? But that's your job. Okay. Emir Hashem, next week, we're going to take a look at the second Rashi in the whole Chumash. And we're going to see how Rashi uses most of these principles all in that one comment. It's a fairly long comment, but still, in that one paragraph, Rashi uses almost all 7 of these. And we'll see how he does that. Okay, thank you very much. Good evening.